Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Jules and I will be telling you the story of a Craigslist killer or killer from the woods. Either way, it's a creepy story that took place in the fall of 2011 in Ohio, Noble County, Ohio to be exact. This is a quiet area, rural. It just seemed like an idyllic place to spend some time earning a little cash for the men that answered the ad placed by Richard Beasley, who at the time was going by the name of Jack in his ads. Let's take a look at the ad that was so alluring to these men that caused one to almost lose his life and three to actually lose their lives. The ad read, "Caretaker position for farm, Southern Ohio. Simply watch over a 688-acre patch of hilly farmland and feed a few cows. You get $300 a week and a nice 2-bedroom trailer. Someone older and single preferred, but will consider all. Relocation a must. You must have a clean record and be trustworthy. This is a permanent position. The farm is used mainly as a hunting preserve. It's overrun with game, has a stocked 3-acre pond, but some beef cattle will be kept. Nearest neighbor is a mile away. The place is secluded and beautiful. It'll be a real getaway for the right person. Job of a lifetime. If you're ready to relocate, please contact ASAP. Position will not stay open. Include your name, age, and phone number in an email, please." So, that was the ad that lured in the victims. And the potential victim, who eventually blew the whole case wide open, his name was Scott. Scott Davis was 48 years old, and he lived in South Carolina. His mother lived in Akron, Ohio, and it was fall. He was thinking that he needed to be closer to his mother, help her through the winter, but he also wanted to maintain his independence. And so he contacted the poster of the ad, who identified himself as Jack, and Jack told him to feel free to bring all his worldly possessions and warned him that the farm was quite secluded and there would be no phone signal out there. And this sounded great to Scott. No big deal. He was on his own. He was 48 years old. He would bring all of his belongings, and that included his Harley Davidson. And Jack said that this sounded awesome and that Scott sounded like a man after his own heart, that he also appreciated motorcycles. And so he said that they should meet up at Shoney's, which was a restaurant in Marietta, which was the next county over from Noble County, where the farm was. And Scott met Jack there at the diner. Jack had his nephew with him, a young man named Brogan. Jack said, "Hey, let's take a ride over and check out the farm. You can see what your new home is going to be like." And Scott thought that would be fine, so he got in the vehicle with Brogan behind the wheel, and they were talking as they drove and drove and drove out into the middle of nowhere, where obviously there was no signal. And then Jack said to his nephew Brogan, "Hey, could you pull over where we shot that deer last week? I need to pick up some equipment that I left behind near there." And so Brogan pulled over, and Scott, not thinking anything of this, hopped out and continued the conversation with Jack as they walked deeper into the woods. Scott was out in front of Jack, and all of a sudden, Scott heard the sound. It sounded kind of like the click of a gun, like a misfire or something. And then he turned and looked over his shoulder, and he saw that Jack was aiming at him. So Scott took off running, Jack on his heels firing at him, and one shot hit Scott in the elbow, and he felt searing pain and blood started dripping, but he kept running like a madman through the woods, found a place to hide, hunkered down, and waited for hours and hours until he was certain that Jack was no longer following him. He was in the clear. And so then he walked and walked until he came upon a farmhouse, and he got there and he asked the inhabitants of the farmhouse to call 911 for him.
911,
and
what's your emergency?
He reported what all had happened. The sheriff was quite surprised by this story because so many elements of it didn't make any sense to him. There was no farm like the one that Scott was describing as being in the ad. He knew of nothing like this, and Scott was taken to the hospital, and the sheriff started trying to follow up on this story. And the first place he went back to the Shoney's. He was going to ask for the surveillance video, but it had been damaged, so he called in the FBI to help try to recover the video from the equipment. Then they went back out to the area where Scott told them that this whole thing had happened, and sure enough, they found the hat that had fallen off his head when he was running. And then they discovered something else super creepy. They found an open, shallow grave nearby, and they realized that this shallow grave must have been meant for Scott. And so the whole thing got a lot more creepy. And it also made it into publications, and a lady, Mrs. Bruce, contacted the sheriff and said, "Hey, my brother, David Pauley, he contacted me a while back saying that he was hired for this dream job that he saw on Craigslist. It sounds just like this one that's advertised about this Scott fellow, and I haven't heard from my brother since." So the sheriff decided to get a closer look at the woods around this shallow grave, and he discovered another grave. And this one was not empty. And this one did contain David Pauley. But the cadaver dogs that were with them also discovered a second grave. This one contained a man who had been there longer, and he was naked, and they had no identification for him, so they didn't know who this victim was, but they did realize that they had a serial killer on their hands, and all they knew was it was some man named Jack, and that he had a nephew named Brogan, and that he met his victims at the Shawnee, and that they were all following the Craigslist ad. So the sheriff had the FBI trace the IP address of who posted this Craigslist ad. And at the same time that was going on, they also got a break, and the camera footage from Shoney's was restored, and they were able to look and see a man and his nephew meeting with Scott. So they took that photographic evidence to the home that matched the IP address of the person who placed the ad. And the man there said that he didn't place any Craigslist ads, but he had a tenant who had been renting a room that had used his computer and had probably posted the Craigslist ad, and that this guy's name was Ralph Geiger, and he identified the picture as being Ralph Geiger, and they decided to lay a trap. Ralph Geiger had not realized that they were onto him, so they had the landlord contact Ralph Geiger and tell him that he received some mail. So Ralph Geiger showed up there, and Richard Beasley was promptly arrested. It turns out that Ralph Geiger was the man in the second grave, the unidentified man, and Richard Beasley had taken over his identification. Ralph Geiger had been the first victim, And Richard Beasley had dyed his hair and was being Ralph Geiger and collecting Ralph Geiger's checks, and lured new victims, because after killing Ralph, that was fairly easy to him, and he just thought this was a great way to get more income. You see, Richard Beasley had a record himself. He also was a street preacher, and he was preying on the people that he was preaching to, turning the women out as prostitutes. And he was in trouble. He had warrants for his arrest, and so he became Ralph. Preacher Beasley had made friends with a family who had a young boy named Brogan Rafferty. He befriended them when Brogan was only about 9 years old, and there were some issues in that family life, and so Brogan latched on to Richard Beasley as kind of like a surrogate father, and went to church with him and such, and he was molded into being the perfect little sidekick slash co-conspirator slash killer. And Richard talked Brogan into digging the shallow grave for Ralph, and then Richard killed Ralph and had Brogan cover it up. Brogan was disturbed and wrote a dark poem about this situation, and claims that he was so afraid of Richard and what Richard could do that he would never turn on him, and was his accomplice for all the other killings that took place. The final killing happened a couple days after Scott Davis had escaped. A fellow named Tim Kerns really was down on his luck and wanted to provide for his young sons. He was a divorced father. Mom had custody of the boys, and Tim doted on his sons to the point where one time his car was broken down and he wasn't going to be able to make it for his visit with his kids, and they were sad, broken up. But a couple hours after they thought he was going to miss their visit, he showed up on a bicycle that he had borrowed. He traveled miles to see his kids. Anyway, Tim had no money, had a broken down car, had nothing that Richard Beasley could benefit from, but Richard Beasley decided to take his life anyway, just for fun, as far as I could tell. And since Scott had escaped from the woods, Richard Beasley decided to kick it up a notch and took Tim Kerns to an abandoned mall and killed him and left him out behind this abandoned mall for no reason other than the enjoyment of killing this man. And when it came time for trial, Richard Beasley's mother was totally convinced that her son was innocent, and he was coming up with all kinds of stories about what had actually happened. Brogan refused to testify against Richard Beasley, citing his fear of Richard Beasley. Brogan did admit what he had done and voiced remorse and, just how bad he felt about what he had done to the families of the victims. But, he was an integral part of taking these men's lives. So Brogan was sentenced to life in prison. He is eligible for parole in 2037. And Richard Beasley was sentenced to lose his life. He will never get out of prison alive. And he appealed that sentence, and his second trial had the same result. So he is currently still awaiting that punishment in prison. And yeah, that's the story of the Craigslist killers slash man who killed people in the woods. And bet you won't look at ads the same way again. And let me know in the comments below how you like this story, and I'll see you in the next video.